Week 6 matchups that matter. This is where we set our fantasy football lineups using all of the available information to us, from over-unders to who's on bye to implied point totals, fastest paced games, all the best matchups for the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end position, and even some sicko talk for you guys that play with defenses and kickers. So without further ado, let's get into it. All right, so after 4 teams on bye in Week 5, we have just 2 teams on bye in Week 6 with the Green Bay Packers and the Pittsburgh Steelers. I could definitely do without subjecting my eyes to the Pittsburgh Steelers offense for a week, so good on them. The over-unders, top 5 over-unders on the week, as you guys can see them on the screen. Home team on the left, away team shortened version there in the middle. With the Los Angeles Chargers Dallas Cowboys game on Monday Night Football, that is expected to be the highest scoring game of the week. The Rams Cardinals, Dolphins Panthers, Chiefs Broncos tonight, and then the Jacksonville Jaguars and Indianapolis Colts. Not a lot of games over a 45-point over-under total. These are the only 5, and we don't have any like 53-point heaters like we did last week. So not a ton of fireworks, especially on the main slate, knowing that 2 of these games are in prime time, one on Thursday and one on Monday as well, and some potential snoozers here. As you guys can see, the bottom 5 over-under games of the slate: Cleveland Browns and 49ers, Tennessee Titans and Baltimore Ravens, which of course will be the London game, so that one's at 9:30 a.m. Eastern. Make sure you set your lineup Saturday night. New York Jets and Philadelphia Eagles, Las Vegas Raiders and New England Patriots, and then Atlanta Falcons and Washington Commanders. These games all under 43-point totals. Probably not a ton of fireworks going on in those games. Try and avoid those in your start-sit decisions if you can help it. Now let's get into the implied point totals of the week. So even though we don't have a ton of high over-unders, we do have a lot of high implied point totals. The Dolphins implied for 31 points, the Bills 29, the Chiefs 28.75, Los Angeles Rams over 27, and Cowboys over 26. Could be a big-time week of blowouts this week. We have not a ton of high over-unders, like I said, but the Rams, Chiefs, Bills, and Dolphins are all touchdown favorites or better and implied for over 27 points. So it's possible we do get some boat races in this week's slate of games. Then the New York Giants, Cleveland Browns, New York Jets, Carolina Panthers, and Denver Broncos. Maybe teams you want to avoid starting players from because they are all implied for 18 or less points. And if you guys have decisions involving players from the teams with a lot of implied points, like Raheem Mostert, for example, versus Breece Hall for the New York Jets, who are implied for 17 points, maybe you go with Raheem Mostert in that start-sit decision. That is how we are using this information as always. Now let's get into where the sharps are betting. So when we look at where the sharps are betting, we can see that the Chargers-Cowboys game is getting some steam on the over, the Rams-Cardinals game as well, Bills-Giants game getting some steam on the over of 44.5, Bengals and Seahawks, a sneaky game that I think could potentially shoot out 79% of the cash on the over there. And then the Dolphins and Panthers, mainly I'm assuming they think the Dolphins might cover that spread themselves like they did against the Denver Broncos a couple of weeks ago. So keep that in mind when you guys are making your start-sit decisions. Keep in mind these high over-under games where the sharps are betting. And then also the sharps are not liking the over on some of these other games. So looks like some potential games to avoid here. This Browns-49ers game, Texans-Saints game, Jets-Eagles game, not expected to be fantasy football bonanzas, as well as this Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Detroit Lions game that was flexed to the 425 window. Should be an interesting real-life game, but the fantasy points may be a little bit hard to come by there. So not going to be probably a very, very high-scoring matchup. So maybe in those instances, you lean towards maybe safer plays than the guys that can give you those boom-bust performances, because if we're not getting a lot of high-scoring games, then usually those boom weeks are harder to come by. So now let's get into the advanced data points. I'll just briefly go through these ones. The fastest paced games of the week, you guys can see them on the screen. Basically what fastest paced games means is that both offenses on either side of the field are running up tempo. And usually this means that we're going to get a lot of projected offensive plays, which means more offensive fantasy production. So this Chargers-Cowboys game, checking a lot of boxes. Jacksonville Jaguars at Colts, I think that one could sneakily go over 45.5. So keep that in mind if you're betting. Raiders-Patriots, Texans-Saints, and Browns 49ers. This is one box that this game is actually checking, is that it could be a little bit faster paced. And then some of the slower paced games, again, the Eagles and Jets game not looking too good. Titans and Ravens in London not looking too good. And then Falcons and Commanders as well. So offensive DVOA versus opponent's defensive DVOA. Basically what this means is how good is the offense, which is the far left column, going up against the opposing defense which is the second from left column, and they get either a matchup advantage or a matchup disadvantage. So if you have a great offense going up against a bad defense, going to be a big-time matchup advantage. If you have a bad offense going up against a good defense, going to be a big-time matchup disadvantage. So Dolphins have the biggest matchup advantage on the week. Of course, they are the highest DVOA offense in the NFL, as is the case for most of the weeks. They're going to be heavily favored to score a lot of points. Of course, the Kansas City Chiefs and the Buffalo Bills, also big-time matchup advantages for them as well, but I'm sure you guys know that those are great offenses. The sneaky ones that I want to point your attention to are the Seattle Seahawks and the Minnesota Vikings. These two teams both have pretty good matchups, so it's possible that we get a lot more fantasy production out of the Seattle Seahawks than we've seen so far this year. Metcalf and Lockett been a little bit quiet so far. Minnesota Vikings, of course, too. Now without Justin Jefferson, still in line to have a lot of good scoring opportunity going up against a porous Bears defense. Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson, those guys could definitely go wild in this game. Then we get into the biggest disadvantages from the matchup DVOA standpoint here. So the Giants offense going up against the Bills defense is the biggest disadvantage by a wide margin. So do not start your New York Giants. Saquon Barkley coming off of a multi-week injury, not a guaranteed start in my opinion. If you have a Raheem Mostert type, if you have a Breece Hall or an Isaiah Pacheco or somebody like that, I would leave Saquon Barkley on your bench if you can help it. Then we also have the Titans offense going up against a tougher Ravens defense, the Bengals offense going up against a tough Seahawks defense, Buccaneers offense against a tough Lions defense, and then Jets offense against a tough Eagles defense. Although I'm not really worried about the Bengals offense because I think we saw them take a big step forward. And of course, these numbers are based on the entirety of the season when the Bengals have not been very good. But I have a feeling that they are going to take a big jump and go on a little bit of a stretch run here for the next couple games. So now let's get into the shadow coverage. So for those of you guys that have wide receiver start-sit decisions, this can be really helpful to determine, who has a good matchup, who could potentially have a spike week here. So let's talk about the downgrades, some of the guys that have tougher matchups to kick off this week 6 slate here. So in terms of raw shadow coverage, we do have one shadow coverage matchup in the tougher matchups bucket here. Terry McLaurin is expected to be shadow covered by the Falcons cornerback AJ Terrell, who of course has been very, very solid over the course of his career, especially the last couple of years. So downgrade for Terry McLaurin, upgrade for Jahan Dotson, and for the rest of the pass catchers there in Washington, maybe Sam Howell looks to spread the ball around as we've seen from him so far this year. Amari Cooper against Charvarius Ward, also not a very good matchup. And then matchup downgrades overall because these are just good corners and good secondaries for the Denver Broncos wide receivers going up against the Kansas City Chiefs corners. Matchup downgrades for the Eagles wide receivers, Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown going up against the Jets corners as well. And then Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel also not in very good spots to hit big this week against the Browns secondary, who has been pretty much the best in the league against fantasy wide receivers. So maybe a George Kittle and a Christian McCaffrey game incoming there for San Francisco. I don't think Brock Purdy is necessarily a must start this week either. And then we get into the yellow matchups. So basically what these matchups mean is just kind of like a neutral situation. I'm kind of just reporting the matchup as it is. Olave and Michael Thomas against the Texans secondary. Not the greatest matchup in the world, but also not the worst matchup in the world. And then we will see a lot of Tyler Lockett versus Chidobe Awuzie in the slot for the Cincinnati Bengals. Also not a great matchup for Tyler Lockett, but I do think he's a good enough receiver to beat Chidobe Awuzie. Then we get into some of the great matchups. So some of these guys are going to see matchup upgrades versus, what they normally are. So if this is a wide receiver 4, maybe he's a wide receiver 3 this week. If this is a wide receiver 3, maybe he's a wide receiver 2 this week. And some of the shadow coverage matchups that apply directly to this is Stephon Diggs versus Adoree Jackson. Steph Diggs has been absolutely unbelievable this year. He is probably going to wipe the floor with the Giants secondary and Adoree Jackson, so no worries for him there. CeeDee Lamb going up against Jasir Taylor. Not going to be a shadow matchup, but he will be his primary cornerback matchup in this game. I think CeeDee Lamb has a big bounce back this week, maybe buy low on him. Jordan Addison and DJ Moore also in very good spots going up against the Bears and Vikings secondaries respectively in that same game. Then we have matchup upgrade for Josh Downs versus Trey Herndon in the slot. The Jags have been very susceptible to slot receivers. And also matchup upgrades for the Los Angeles Rams wide receivers, Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, and Tutu Atwell if you're desperate for a flex play. And then also for the Atlanta Falcons wide receivers, Drake London and Kyle Pitts going up against the Commanders secondary. And of course, we're seeing Desmond Ridder play a little bit better as well. So a matchup upgrade for those guys also. Now let's get into the positional matchups. So we're going to go through top 5 quarterback matchups, top 5 wide receiver matchups, top 5 running back matchups, so on and so forth. So some of the quarterbacks with great matchups this week, you guys can see there, Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, and Kirk Cousins. All of those guys are top 10 plays for me. So they are in your lineup no matter what. If you need a good streaming option, if you're streaming the quarterback position because, maybe you have somebody on bye or whatever the case is, Matthew Stafford and Dak Prescott are both really solid options in good matchups, so keep an eye on those guys. And then if you guys don't have those players available on your waiver wire, Geno Smith and Sam Howell are fine if you have to dig deeper for a quarterback with a good matchup. And as far as quarterbacks that don't have good matchups, leave Daniel Jones, Jared Goff, Ryan Tannehill, and CJ Stroud on the bench if you can help it. If you don't have better options, I suppose you could play those guys, although Goff is the best option of that group if you had to choose between some of those options there. And then also temper expectations for Justin Herbert. He has a tough matchup, but you're still starting him in a 50.5 point over-under game, the highest on the entire week. And also Justin Herbert is a good enough quarterback to beat any matchup that he's faced with. Now let's get into the running back position. You guys can see some of the great matchups on deck for a lot of RB2 types. Isaiah Pacheco, Alexander Mattison, Kyron Williams, and Alvin Kamara. Isaiah Pacheco specifically going up against the Broncos. They have been the worst defense in the NFL at adjusted fantasy points allowed to the running back position. And same goes for pretty much the Bears on that Minnesota Vikings matchup, as well as Kyron Williams matchup against the Arizona Cardinals. The Carolina Panthers have a good matchup in theory, but it's probably going to be a negative game script. They're like 2 touchdown underdogs to the Miami Dolphins, and we don't know what the health status is of Miles Sanders, and when the health status is up in the air, it seems like Chuba Hubbard and Miles Sanders are kind of splitting the backfield, so I'd probably avoid the Carolina Panthers, although they are in a good matchup this week. Some of the tougher matchups at the running back position we have here for Dameon Pierce, Austin Eckler, and Breece Hall. All of these guys have tougher matchups, so temper expectations for them. Then when it comes to Jonathan Taylor, you really want to temper expectations for him because coming off of the PUP last week, he barely played. He played like 18% of the snaps. Zach Moss was heavily involved. He had a monster game. I'd imagine that Jonathan Taylor will inch closer into his full workload, maybe about 80% of that full workload that we're expecting. So I would still play Jonathan Taylor as like a top 20 running back, top 18 running back. But just keep that in mind. He's not a must play if you have better options on your team. And then the Cardinals backfield was the source of a lot of waiver ads, I'm sure, this week. Amari DiMercado, Keontae Ingram, both of these guys were top waiver ads for a lot of people. I actually secured DiMercado on my waivers in my home league for 31 fab bucks. It's a brutal matchup for these guys against the Rams front. They've been pretty good against the run so far, and it's potentially a negative game script. So with Ingram coming off of an injury, it's a bad matchup on the ground. I lean DiMercado if you guys are going to play one of these Cardinals running backs. Let's say you have both, especially knowing that the Cardinals should be playing from behind. They're a touchdown underdog on the road against the Los Angeles Rams. So if you don't need to play DiMercado, I probably wouldn't. But if you're wondering which Cardinals running back I would play, it would definitely be DiMercado for sure. So the wide receiver matchups, I'll breeze through some of these here. DJ Moore, CeeDee Lamb, Calvin Ridley, all these guys appear to be in smash spots. So if you have them, feel good about their matchups this week. Although the Vikings have specifically limited number one wide receivers in DJ Moore's case, that's something to keep in mind. I don't know exactly what that means. Maybe they're just bracketing number ones on most weeks. Darnell Mooney could be in play as a result of that, but probably just a desperation play if you guys have a lot of players on bye. And then Christian Kirk, Zay Flowers, Jordan Addison, and Zay Jones, also from the teams that you have listed here on the screen as good matchups. Those guys are all very good flex plays. I actually traded for Christian Kirk this past week. And then the wide receivers that have bad matchups, we have the 49ers wide receivers, Ayuk and Deebo Samuel, Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions, Keenan Allen of the Los Angeles Chargers, and then A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith of the Eagles. Also in for tougher matchups than usual. You're still starting all 6 of the players that I just mentioned as top 20 options, but temper expectations. They could have a down week potentially. And then the Broncos are the only sittable guys that have tough matchups here. With Courtland Sutton and with Jerry Jeudy, I don't think either of them are a must-start player. I think that they're both outside my top 35 overall wide receivers. If you have Jacoby Myers, if you have Adam Thielen, like I would play those guys over Courtland Sutton or Jerry Jeudy going up against Snead and McDuffie in shadow coverages respectively. So I probably wouldn't force it. Plus, I mean, we have Thursday Night Football is always a little bit wonky. They're a touchdown underdog, although it is worth noting that Jerry Jeudy did have a monster game against the Kansas City Chiefs last year. He had like 4 or 5 touchdowns in that game. So maybe he's going to be just good against this team in general. So now we get into the tight end matchups. You guys can see them on the screen right there. The left side, of course, with the good matchups, Travis Kelce, Dallas Goedert, and Zach Ertz are all starting options for you. So if you have those tight ends, they're in very good matchups this week. If you need a streamer, let's say you have somebody on bye like a Freiermuth or something like that, Noah Fant is my favorite streamer of the week. He should be available in a lot of leagues. I also really like Gerald Everett, who's available in a lot of leagues coming off of his bye. And then also, if you're really desperate, I think Tyler Conklin is not a bad one as well. And then as far as tight ends with bad matchups, leave Dalton Schultz, Chigakonkwo, Irv Smith on the bench. Temper expectations for Kyle Pitts and Darren Waller, although both of those guys are pretty much deployed as wide receivers. So tight end matchups don't quite apply for Kyle Pitts and Darren Waller the way that they're used. So if you guys are sickos and you play in defense and kicker leagues, you guys can see both the defensive matchups and the kicker matchups on either side of me right now. The Bills, 49ers, Falcons, and Dolphins defenses are all really, really good options this week if you're looking for a defense to stream. Always target these bad quarterbacks. Of course, the Bills going up against Daniel Jones. We have the Falcons going up against Sam Howell. We have the 49ers going up against Deshaun Watson, who's a little turnover prone. And then we have the Dolphins going up against Bryce Young, who's been known to turn the ball over as well. And then if you're really desperate, none of those guys are available. The Las Vegas Raiders, Minnesota Vikings, and Washington Commanders are fine streamers this week. So if you got some value from this video, if I helped you set your lineup, least you could do is leave a like down below, subscribe to the channel if you are new around here. If you want access to all of this data, if you want access to my weekly rankings to help you set your lineups, if you want access to our rest of season rankings to help you with trade negotiations, so if I'm trading away DK Metcalf, who's a receiver that's relatively in that range, or if I'm trading away Chris Olave, who's a receiver that's relatively in that range, we have you covered with our rest of season rankings. Those are updated weekly, so you know who are the best options going forward, and you can make informed trades as a result of that. So if that interests you, check out the link in the pinned comment down below. flockfantasy.com. Promo code FSE is where you can find that. You'll also get our Dynasty rankings. I'm going to be writing a couple articles here soon about the Dynasty landscape of the college football season, so definitely stay tuned for that if you guys play Dynasty as well. But with that being said, peace out, and we'll talk to you soon.